June 14th, 1956. 3:47 p.m. Ruthie Johnson was 19 years old, walking home from City College on a Thursday afternoon, carrying textbooks on American literature and constitutional law. She wore a yellow sundress her mother had bought from a boutique on 125th Street, saddle shoes polished to shine, hair styled in the neat waves that were fashionable among young black women attending university in 1950s New York. She was 7 blocks from her family's brownstone at 409 Edgecombe Avenue in Sugar Hill, the most prestigious black neighborhood in America, where Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall lived 3 buildings down, where Duke Ellington kept an apartment, where the educated elite of Harlem had built lives that defied every racist assumption about black capability. Ruthie was humming a Nat King Cole song when she noticed the car. A 1954 Ford sedan, cream-colored with Georgia license plates, driving slowly beside her on St. Nicholas Avenue. 2 white men in the front seat, both wearing casual clothes, work shirts, suspenders, nothing remarkable. But their eyes followed her with an intensity that made her skin crawl. She walked faster. The car accelerated slightly, keeping pace. According to testimony Ruthie would later give to her father, testimony that never appeared in any police report or FBI file, one of the men rolled down his window and called out, "Hey girl, you Bumpy Johnson's daughter?" Ruthie didn't answer, didn't look, kept walking. The passenger door opened while the car was still moving. A man stepped out, tall, heavy-set, with a thick southern accent that carried across the street. "I'm talking to you, girl. Your daddy's that nigger gangster, ain't he?" 3 pedestrians on St. Nicholas Avenue that afternoon would later tell community activists that they witnessed the interaction but were too frightened to intervene. The men from a Georgia car weren't just hostile. They radiated something more organized, more ideological, more dangerous than typical street harassment. One witness, Marcus Webb, a 52-year-old postal worker, would describe it years later to researchers from Columbia University's Oral History Project. Those men weren't trying to rob her. They weren't even trying to hurt her right then. They were trying to send a message. You could see it in how deliberate they were, how they wanted people to notice. That's what made it terrifying. Ruthie ran, not toward home, that would lead them directly to her address. Instead, she ran toward 155th Street, toward the crowd, toward the bus stop where dozens of people were waiting, where witnesses would make violence difficult. The car followed, engine revving. She made it to the corner of 155th and St. Nicholas just as a crosstown bus was loading passengers. She pushed through the crowd, fumbled for a token, and climbed aboard without looking back. Through the bus window, she saw both men standing on the sidewalk, watching. Not chasing, just watching. One of them, the driver, pulled something from his jacket pocket. Even from 30 feet away, Ruthie recognized it. A small card, white with red lettering. A business card. He held it up deliberately, making sure she could see it, then placed it carefully on the sidewalk, weighted down with a rock so it wouldn't blow away. The bus pulled away from the curb. Ruthie sat in the back, shaking so violently that an elderly woman beside her asked if she needed help. Ruthie couldn't speak, could barely breathe, because she understood, with the terrible clarity that comes from growing up as Bumpy Johnson's daughter, that this wasn't random harassment. This was reconnaissance. Those men had followed her to learn her routine, her route, her vulnerabilities. They'd announced themselves deliberately, making sure she knew they knew who she was. And they'd left something behind. A message. By 4:30 p.m., Ruthie was home, sitting in her father's study, trying to explain what had happened while her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Bumpy Johnson, 51 years old, wearing reading glasses and a cardigan sweater, looking more like a college professor than Harlem's most feared organized crime figure, listened without interrupting. His face remained perfectly calm, but his wife Mamie, standing in the doorway, would later tell their pastor that she'd never seen her husband's eyes turn that cold. "Did they touch you?" Bumpy asked quietly. "No, they just followed me. Asked if I was your daughter." "Used." Ruthie couldn't say the word. Didn't need to. Where did they leave the card? Corner of 155th and St. Nicholas. Southwest corner, near the mailbox. Bumpy stood, removed his reading glasses, and walked to the window overlooking Edgecombe Avenue. For 2 full minutes, he said nothing, just stared out at the neighborhood he'd protected for 25 years. The community where his daughter should have been safe to walk home from college without fear. Finally, he turned to Mamie. Call Cat. Tell him to meet me at that corner. Now. Then he looked at Ruthie, and his expression softened just slightly. Baby girl, I need you to understand something. What happened today isn't your fault, and it's going to be handled. But I need to know, did you recognize anything else about them? The car? Their voices? Anything? Ruthie thought hard, forcing herself past fear into observation. The driver had a scar. Right here. She touched her left cheek, and there was something in the back seat. Looked like folded cloth. White cloth. Lots of it. Bumpy and Mamie locked eyes. White cloth. Folded in a car with Georgia plates. Men using racial slurs in broad daylight on a Harlem street. Klan robes. Stay inside until I get back, Bumpy said. Don't answer the door. Don't go near the windows. Mamie, call Teddy and Red. Tell them I need everything they can find on white supremacist activity in the city. Every name, every known associate, every place they meet. He put on his suit jacket, checked his appearance in the hallway mirror, immaculate as always, and walked out the front door with the measured pace of a man who had all the time in the world. But Clarence Cat Williams, who arrived at 409 Edgecombe Avenue 6 minutes later, would tell associates that when Bumpy gave instructions about what needed to happen next, his voice carried a tone Cat had only heard twice before. Once in 1935, when Dutch Schultz had tried to take over Harlem, and once in 1944, when a crooked cop had beaten a numbers runner to death. We're going to find out who these men are, Bumpy had said quietly. We're going to find out who sent them. We're going to find out everyone who knew about this. And then we're going to teach a lesson that ensures this never happens again. What kind of lesson? Cat had asked. Bumpy's answer was simple, the kind that doesn't require bodies. The kind that makes them wish there had been bodies, because at least that would have been quick. By 5:15 p.m., the business card had been retrieved from the corner of 155th and St. Nicholas. It wasn't a Klan recruiting card, as some might have expected. It was worse. The card contained a name, William Cooper, Masonry and Construction, and a telephone number with a Manhattan exchange. But on the back, written in pencil, tell your daddy we know where you go to school. We know where you live. We know you got a younger sister, too. Ruthie's sister Margaret was 16 years old, still in high school at Washington Irving. This wasn't a threat against Bumpy Johnson. This was a threat against his children. In the complex codes that governed organized crime, street violence, and criminal honor in 1950s Harlem, threatening a man's family was the one transgression that erased all rules. What Bumpy Johnson did over the next 11 days would never appear in police records. The FBI surveillance logs for that period contain unexplained gaps. The New York Times never reported it. Even the Amsterdam News, Harlem's primary black newspaper, which covered Johnson's activities extensively, remained silent. But 37 people witnessed what happened. 12 were directly involved. And over the decades, through oral histories, sealed testimony, and deathbed confessions, the story has emerged. Not as official history, as something more dangerous, as legend that carried a warning for anyone foolish enough to threaten Bumpy Johnson's family. The warning was simple. You can come after me. You can challenge my business. You can even try to kill me. But touch my children, and you'll discover that some men have resources that make death look merciful. To understand what Bumpy Johnson did after June 14th, 1956, you need to understand what he'd built by that point in his life, and more importantly, why he'd built it. The popular imagination pictures Bumpy Johnson as a gangster, a criminal, Harlem's godfather. All of those descriptions are partially true and entirely incomplete. By 1956, Johnson was a 51-year-old grandfather figure who'd survived Dutch Schultz, Lucky Luciano, federal prison, and countless rivals who'd thought Harlem was territory they could simply take. He controlled numbers operations, generating an estimated $50 million annually across the neighborhood. He owned legitimate businesses, funeral homes, taxi services, real estate. He employed over 400 people directly and influenced the economic survival of thousands more. But all of that, the money, the power, the reputation, existed to protect something Johnson valued more than his own life: his family. Ruthie and Margaret Johnson had grown up unlike most children in Harlem. They attended the best schools. They took piano lessons. They spent summers in Martha's Vineyard with black professional families who'd achieved success through medicine, law, and business rather than the underworld. Johnson had insisted on this. According to Mamie Johnson's memoir, published in 2008, Bumpy had made his position clear from the day Ruthie was born. My daughters will have choices I never had. They'll go to college. They'll have careers. They'll never need to operate in the shadows because I operated there, so they wouldn't have to. By 1956, that vision was succeeding. Ruthie was at City College studying law, planning to become one of the first black female attorneys in New York. Margaret was excelling at Washington Irving High School, already accepted into early admission programs at 3 universities. They were living proof that black children, even those born to controversial fathers, could achieve anything if given opportunity and protection. That protection had always been comprehensive. Bumpy had arranged with local police, through carefully managed relationships and strategic payments, to ensure increased patrols near his daughter's schools. He'd hired off-duty officers to provide invisible security during their daily routines. He'd invested in community programs that reduced street crime in areas his daughters frequented. He'd even funded scholarships at City College specifically for Harlem students, ensuring his daughters attended school in an environment where they were respected rather than isolated. The system had worked flawlessly for 19 years, until June 14, 1956, when 2 men with Georgia plates proved that hatred could penetrate even the most sophisticated security. The incident revealed a vulnerability Johnson hadn't fully prepared for, that racial violence from outside Harlem could strike at his family despite all his local power. The Ku Klux Klan in 1956 was experiencing a resurgence. The Supreme Court's Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954 had triggered massive white resistance across the South. Klan membership had increased from approximately 10,000 in 1950 to over 40,000 by 1956, according to FBI estimates. And increasingly, Klan organizers were traveling north, targeting prominent black figures in northern cities to send messages about the limits of black advancement. Bumpy Johnson, as the most visible symbol of black power and success in Harlem, had always been a potential target. But he'd assumed his reputation for ruthlessness would deter such attacks. He'd been wrong. Within 2 hours of retrieving the business card, Bumpy's network began gathering information. Teddy Simmons, Johnson's political fixer, made calls to contacts of the NYPD, the New York State Commission on Human Rights, and a federal prosecutor he'd helped get elected. Within 90 minutes, he had preliminary information. William Cooper was real. He operated a small masonry business on the Lower East Side, and he'd been spotted at a meeting 3 weeks earlier in a warehouse in Queens that police suspected was being used by white supremacist groups. Red Mitchell, who handled intelligence operations, deployed street-level informants across Manhattan. By 7 p.m. on June 14th, he had descriptions of the 2 men who'd followed Ruthie. The driver matched a man named Earl Watkins, originally from Valdosta, Georgia, with previous arrests for assault and intimidation related to civil rights workers in the South. The passenger was likely Vernon Hayes, another Georgian with connections to the KKK chapter in Cobb County. But the most crucial information came from Solomon Sol Greenberg, the accountant who'd helped Johnson navigate complex financial operations for decades. Greenberg had a network that extended into areas most people wouldn't expect. He knew accountants for right-wing organizations. He tracked tax-exempt status of suspicious civic groups. He maintained files on extremist financing. Why midnight on June 14th, Greenberg walked into Johnson's study with a folder containing financial records showing that William Cooper's masonry business had received $8,500 in unexplained deposits over the past 6 months, all from a Georgia-based organization called the Southern Heritage Foundation, a known front for Klan fundraising. The picture came into focus. Cooper was being paid to provide infrastructure, meeting spaces, safe houses, logistical support for Klan operations in New York. Watkins and Hayes were enforcers who'd been sent north specifically to intimidate prominent black figures and their families. And Ruthie had been targeted not randomly, but strategically, as a warning that even Bumpy Johnson's children weren't safe. They wanted you to know they'd been here, Red Mitchell explained during the midnight meeting at Johnson's apartment. They wanted you scared, wanted you to pull back, to be less visible, to stop being an example of black success. Bumpy lit a cigarette, a habit he'd mostly quit but returned to during stress, and studied the information spread across his desk. They made a mistake, he said quietly. What mistake? Cat Williams asked. They assumed fear would make me cautious, that threatening my daughters would make me retreat. Bumpy looked up, and everyone in the room recognized the expression. Instead, they just removed every restraint I normally operate under. Madame Stephanie St. Clair, now 75 years old, but still sharp as ever, spoke from her chair near the window. Bumpy, you need to think carefully here. This isn't Italian mobsters fighting over territory. This isn't corrupt cops you can negotiate with. These are true believers, ideologues. They'll martyr themselves rather than back down. Then we don't give them the opportunity to martyr themselves, Bumpy replied. We do something they won't expect, something that destroys them without creating martyrs, something that uses their own hatred against them. What do you have in mind? St. Clair asked. Bumpy smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. We're going to give them exactly what they fear most. Not black violence, not retaliation. Something worse. We're going to make them irrelevant. We're going to expose them so completely, so publicly, that they become laughingstocks rather than threats. The plan he outlined over the next hour was sophisticated, dangerous, and entirely dependent on resources only Bumpy Johnson could marshal. It required cooperation from the FBI, the same FBI that had tried to imprison him. It required assistance from the NYPD, officers who officially opposed everything he represented. It required coordination with civil rights organizations that publicly denounced his criminal activities. And it required one more element. Bumpy would need to make himself vulnerable, to expose himself to danger, to become bait in a trap that would either destroy the Klan's New York operation or get him killed. You understand what you're proposing? St. Clair asked after he'd finished explaining. You're talking about trusting people who've wanted you in prison for decades. No, Bumpy corrected. I'm talking about recognizing that sometimes enemies share common interests. The FBI doesn't want Klan violence in New York any more than I do. They just need a reason to act that doesn't make them look like they're protecting a black criminal. And if it goes wrong, Mamie asked from the doorway, having listened to the entire conversation, if they use this as an opportunity to take you down? Bumpy looked at his wife, and his expression softened. Then at least you and the girls will be safe. Because whatever happens to me, this ends. Either the Klan's operation in New York gets destroyed, or I do. But our daughters don't live in fear. It was decided. Over the next 11 days, Bumpy Johnson would orchestrate the most complex operation of his criminal career, one that would require cooperation with his enemies, sacrifice of his own safety, and precision that allowed no mistakes. Because the men who'd followed his daughter home had made one fatal miscalculation. They'd assumed Bumpy Johnson's greatest strength was his willingness to use violence. They'd never considered that his real power came from understanding people, their fears, their ambitions, their weaknesses better than they understood themselves. and they were about to learn that lesson in the most devastating way possible. June 15th, 1956, 9 a.m. FBI Special Agent Robert Lucy sat in his office at the New York field office, reading surveillance reports on Johnson's activities, when his secretary buzzed the intercom. "Sir, you have a visitor. Says it's urgent. Won't give a name, but he says you'll want to hear what he has to say about," and I quote, "white supremacist terrorism against federal interests." Lucy had been investigating organized crime in Harlem for 7 years. He'd built extensive files on Johnson, tried multiple times to develop cases that would stick, and failed repeatedly because Johnson operated with a sophistication that made prosecution nearly impossible. He'd never expected Johnson to walk into FBI headquarters voluntarily. But when his secretary showed the visitor in, there he was, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, carrying a leather briefcase, looking like a corporate attorney rather than a criminal. "Agent Lucy," Johnson said, extending his hand. "Thank you for seeing me without an appointment." Lucy didn't shake the offer hand. "Mr. Johnson, I assume you're not here to confess to federal crimes." "No," Johnson replied, sitting down without being invited. "I'm here to help you prevent them." For the next 40 minutes, Johnson laid out everything his network had discovered: William Cooper's operation, the Georgia Klan's expansion into New York, the financial trail showing organized funding, and most importantly, the fact that Johnson's daughter had been targeted as part of a broader campaign to intimidate black leaders across the Northeast. "Why bring this to me?" Lucy asked when Johnson finished. "You've spent 20 years avoiding federal law enforcement. Now you're volunteering information?" "Because this is bigger than our usual disagreements," Johnson replied. "You think I'm a criminal. I think your definition of criminality ignores systemic racism that makes my activities necessary. We can debate that another time. Right now, we have a common problem: white supremacist terrorists operating in New York, targeting civilians, including children." Lucy leaned back in his chair, studying Johnson carefully. "What do you want from me?" "Raid William Cooper's business. Execute federal search warrants. You'll find evidence of interstate conspiracy, weapons violations, and documentation of planned attacks against multiple black families, not just mine. You'll break up their New York operation and probably get promoted for it." "In exchange for?" "Nothing," Johnson said. "I don't want immunity. I don't want charges dropped. I don't even want you to stop investigating me. I just want these men arrested before they hurt someone's daughter who doesn't have the resources to protect herself." Lucy was silent for a long moment. Every instinct screamed that this was a trap, some kind of manipulation Johnson was famous for. But the information was specific, detailed, and easily verifiable. "I'll need to corroborate everything you've told me," Lucy said finally. "Of course," Johnson agreed. "Start with Cooper's bank records. The Southern Heritage Foundation deposits. They're sloppy about covering their financial trails because they assume Northern law enforcement doesn't care about Southern racism." Johnson stood, preparing to leave, then paused at the door. "Agent Lucy, I know you think I'm Harlem's biggest problem, but there are worse problems. These men don't want to control neighborhoods. They want to terrorize entire populations. If you can't see the difference between what I do and what they do, you're not the investigator I've been told you are." He walked out before Lucy could respond. By 2 p.m. that same day, FBI agents were reviewing Johnson's allegations. By 6 p.m., they'd confirmed the Southern Heritage Foundation deposits. By midnight, they were preparing warrant applications. But Johnson wasn't relying solely on federal law enforcement. June 16, 1956, 11 a.m. Captain Thomas Harrigan of the NYPD's 32nd Precinct had a complicated relationship with Bumpy Johnson. Officially, Harrigan was supposed to arrest him. Unofficially, Harrigan understood that Johnson's organization prevented more crime than it caused by maintaining order, mediating disputes, and keeping violent outsiders from destabilizing the neighborhood. When Johnson walked into Harrigan's office, again, voluntarily, stunning the desk sergeant, Harrigan knew something extraordinary was happening. "Captain," Johnson said, sitting across from Harrigan's cluttered desk, We need to discuss a potential riot situation. Harrigan's eyebrows rose. Riot? The men who follow my daughter are planning something bigger. According to my sources, they're organizing a demonstration. They call it a Rally for Southern Heritage in Columbus Circle next week. It's designed to provoke confrontation with Black New Yorkers. They want violence. They want headlines. They want to demonstrate that they can operate in New York with impunity. Harrigan pulled out a notepad. You have specifics. Johnson slid a folder across the desk. Inside, dates, locations, names of 23 individuals who'd been recruited for the demonstration, and most damningly, intercepted correspondence discussing plans to encourage physical confrontation with local coloreds. Where did you get this? Harrigan demanded. Does it matter? Johnson replied. What matters is whether the NYPD want a race riot in Manhattan or whether you want to prevent one. Harrigan studied the documents. If they were legitimate, they represented actionable intelligence on a planned violent demonstration. If he acted on Johnson's information and prevented violence, he'd be a hero. If he ignored it and riots erupted, he'd be blamed. What do you want from me? Harrigan asked. Heavy police presence at Columbus Circle next Wednesday. Enough officers that these fools abandon their plans. And if they don't abandon them, enough officers to arrest them before violence starts. That's it. That's it. Harrigan looked skeptical. You're just being a concerned citizen? Johnson's expression hardened slightly. Captain, I've lived in Harlem for 37 years. I've built businesses, employed hundreds of people, and yes, operated outside your laws because those laws were designed to keep people like me powerless. But I've never, not once, advocated for or encouraged racial violence. These men want to bring Southern lynching mentality to New York. If you think I'm a bigger threat than that, you need to reconsider your priorities. The meeting ended with Harrigan agreeing to review the intelligence and coordinate with appropriate departments. It was more than Johnson had expected, but the most crucial alliance, and the most dangerous, was yet to come. June 17, 1956, 7 p.m. The meeting took place at a small church in Brooklyn, arranged through intermediaries, with both parties understanding that discovery would ruin reputations on both sides. Thurgood Marshall, the NAACP's chief legal counsel, the man who'd argued Brown versus Board of Education, arguably the most important civil rights attorney in America, sat in a basement meeting room waiting for Bumpy Johnson to arrive. Marshall had spent his career fighting for civil rights through legal channels, through courts and legislation and constitutional arguments. Johnson had spent his career operating in exactly the shadows Marshall was trying to eliminate. They should have been enemies. Instead, they were about to become temporary allies. Mr. Marshall, Johnson said, entering through a side door accompanied only by Red Mitchell. Thank you for meeting me. Marshall studied Johnson carefully. I'm here because Adam Powell asked me to hear you out. But understand, I don't endorse what you do. I don't approve of your methods. And if this meeting becomes public, I will deny it ever happened. Understood, Johnson replied. I'm not asking for your approval. I'm asking for your help protecting Black families from Klan violence in New York. For the next hour, Johnson explained the situation, his daughter being followed, the broader Klan operation, the planned demonstration, and his coordination with the FBI and NYPD. What do you need from me? Marshall asked when Johnson finished. The NAACP to publicly announce it's aware of white supremacist activity in New York and is calling for federal investigation. Make it a civil rights issue, not a crime issue. That gives the FBI political cover to act aggressively. Marshall was quiet for a long moment. You understand what you're asking? You're asking me to help you, a known criminal, orchestrate a law enforcement operation. I'm asking you to protect Black children from terrorists, Johnson corrected. The fact that I happen to be involved is unfortunate but necessary. These men targeted my daughter because she's visible, educated, successful. Everything the Klan fears about Black advancement. If they succeed, if they're allowed to operate here without consequences, every Black family with ambitious children becomes a target. Marshall stood, walked to the small church window overlooking a quiet Brooklyn street. Finally, he turned back. The NAACP will issue a statement tomorrow about reports of organized hate group activity in New York. We'll call for federal investigation and demand police protection for communities at risk. That's all I can do. That's enough, Johnson said. If you're captivated by this untold chapter of American history, make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next reveals how one man's fury became an entire city's protection. The pieces were in place: federal investigation, police awareness, civil rights pressure. But Johnson needed one more element to ensure the trap would close completely. He needed to make William Cooper and his associates believe they were winning. June 18th, 1956. For 3 days, Bumpy Johnson did something he'd never done in his entire criminal career. He showed fear. Not real fear. Johnson hadn't been genuinely afraid since Dutch Schultz tried to kill him in 1935 and failed. But performance of fear, visible anxiety, the appearance of a man suddenly vulnerable and uncertain. He pulled his daughters from school, telling administrators there had been family health concerns. He canceled his regular Tuesday breakfast at Wells Supper Club. He stopped appearing at the social clubs and restaurants where he typically conducted business. To anyone watching, and William Cooper's people were definitely watching, Bumpy Johnson looked like a man who'd been intimidated into hiding, which was exactly the impression he wanted to create. According to later testimony from Marcus Webb, one of Johnson's trusted associates who witnessed the strategy meetings, Johnson had been explicit: Cooper needs to believe he's won. That threatening my daughter accomplished what Dutch Schultz's guns couldn't, making me retreat. Pride makes people careless. Let's give him a pride that destroys him. The performance was elaborate and convincing. Red Mitchell spread word through carefully selected channels. Bars where Cooper's associates drank, construction sites where they worked, even a barbershop in Queens where white supremacist sympathizers gathered. The message was always subtle but clear. Bumpy Johnson was scared. His daughter's incident had shaken him. The mighty Harlem boss was suddenly looking over his shoulder. By June 20th, Cooper's people were celebrating. An FBI wiretap, authorized after Johnson's information proved accurate, captured a phone conversation between Cooper and Earl Watkins, the man who'd followed Ruthie. Cooper, you hear about Johnson? He's pulled his kids out of school. Hasn't been seen in public for days. We broke him. Watkins, you think he'll back down from the rally? Cooper, I think he'll stay hidden and hope we forget about him. That's what these people do when they realize they can't win. Watkins, what about the cops? Any heat? Cooper, nothing. They don't care about intimidation. They're probably glad someone's putting these uppity Harlem types in their place. The FBI agents monitoring the call flagged it immediately as evidence of criminal conspiracy. But they were under orders from Agent Lucy to wait. Johnson had convinced them that arresting Cooper too early would only scatter the network. Better to wait until the planned demonstration, when all the key players would be in one place. Meanwhile, Johnson was preparing the actual trap. June 21st, 1956. 8 p.m. A small restaurant in the Bronx, far from Harlem, far from anywhere Johnson would normally conduct business. Present, Johnson, Cat Williams, Teddy Simmons, Red Mitchell, and 5 community organizers from different Harlem churches and civil rights groups. The rally is scheduled for June 25th, Columbus Circle, 2 p.m., Johnson explained, pointing to a map spread across the table. Cooper's expecting maybe 30 of his people, and he's hoping for confrontation with black New Yorkers so he can claim persecution. We're going to give him something different. What? Asked Reverend David Henderson from Mount Zion Baptist Church. An audience, Johnson replied, but not the audience he expects. We're going to have 200 black New Yorkers, professionals, students, families, show up at Columbus Circle. Not to fight, not to protest, simply to exist, to walk through the area, shop at stores, eat at restaurants, completely ignoring Cooper's demonstration. The room was silent as people processed the strategy. You're going to make them irrelevant, Reverend Henderson said slowly. Exactly, Johnson confirmed. They want confrontation because confrontation validates their importance. They want us angry because anger makes them feel powerful. Instead, we're going to treat them like the insignificant fools they are. 200 successful, dignified black New Yorkers living their lives while a handful of bigots shout into the void. And the police? Teddy Simmons asked. We'll be there in force, Johnson said. Captain Harrigan's putting 70 officers at Columbus Circle, officially to prevent violence. Actually, to ensure the only people who look threatening are Cooper's crew. When the media shows up, and they will show up, because I've made sure every newspaper in the city knows about this, they'll see peaceful black citizens being harassed by a tiny group of out-of-state extremists. Red Mitchell smiled. You're going to humiliate them. I'm going to destroy them, Johnson corrected. Humiliation is just the public part. The FBI arrests happened immediately after, based on evidence of interstate conspiracy and weapons violations. By next week, Cooper and his entire network are facing federal charges, and the narrative is set. White supremacists try to bring Southern terrorism to New York, and New York, black and white together, rejected them. One of the community organizers, a young woman named Dorothy Small who worked with the NAACP, asked the question everyone was thinking, why do you care about the narrative, Mr. Johnson? Why not just handle this the way you usually handle threats? Johnson was quiet for a moment. Then, because my daughter shouldn't have to live in a world where her father's reputation for violence is her only protection. She should live in a world where the law actually protects her, where society values her, where she doesn't need a criminal father to keep her safe. I can't create that world, but maybe I can show that it's possible, even if just for one afternoon. The plan was set, but Johnson had one more element to arrange. The most personal, the most dangerous, the most necessary. He needed to confront William Cooper directly. June 23, 1956, 4:30 p.m. William Cooper's masonry business occupied a small storefront on Delancey Street on the Lower East Side. The building looked legitimate enough. Trucks with company logos, construction equipment visible through windows, workers coming and going. But Red Mitchell's surveillance had revealed what the business really was: a front for coordinating white supremacist activity, a gathering place for extremists, a headquarters for the kind of hatred that had followed Ruthie Johnson home from school. Bumpy Johnson walked through the front door alone at 4:30 p.m., wearing his usual impeccable suit, carrying no weapons, accompanied by no bodyguards. Cooper was behind the counter, reviewing paperwork, when Johnson entered. He looked up, startled. Clearly he recognized the most famous black face in New York, but tried to maintain composure. "We're closed," Cooper said, his southern accent thick and hostile. "No, you're not," Johnson replied calmly. "Your sign says open until 6. I don't serve your kind." Johnson smiled. "Good thing I'm not here from Masonry Services. I'm here to deliver a message about my daughter." Cooper's hand moved slightly towards something under the counter, probably a weapon. But Johnson remained perfectly still, perfectly calm, showing no threat. "Your boys followed her home from school," Johnson continued. "Scared her. Left a card with threats about knowing where my children go, where they live. That was a mistake, Mr. Cooper. A profound, career-ending mistake." Cooper's face flushed red. "You threatening me, boy?" "No," Johnson replied. "I'm informing you. See, you thought intimidating my daughter would make me weak, would make me retreat. Instead, you gave me motivation to dismantle your entire operation. And over the past 9 days, that's exactly what I've done. You're bluffing." Johnson pulled a folded newspaper from his jacket pocket, that morning's New York Times, and laid it on the counter. The headline read, "FBI investigates hate group activity in New York." "That's you they're investigating," Johnson said. "Your bank records, your communications with Georgia, your plans for violence. All of it compiled and delivered to federal law enforcement by the man whose daughter you threatened." Cooper's face went from red to pale. "By next week," Johnson continued, "you'll be under arrest. Your business will be seized. Your associates will be testifying against each other to reduce their sentences. In your little demonstration at Columbus Circle, it'll be remembered as the day a handful of cowards learned that New York doesn't tolerate Southern terrorism." "You can't." "I already did," Johnson interrupted. "And here's what you need to understand, Mr. Cooper. I'm not doing this because I'm powerful. I'm doing this because my daughter deserves to walk home from school without fear. Every black child in this city deserves that. And men like you, who think hatred gives you authority, need to learn that there are forms of power you can't compete with." Johnson turned to leave, then paused at the door. Oh, and one more thing. If anything, and I mean anything, happens to my daughters, to my wife, to anyone in my family between now and your arrest, I won't use the FBI or the police or legal channels. I'll use methods that would make your Klan lynchings look merciful by comparison. We clear. Cooper said nothing, just stood behind his counter, understanding that he'd mistaken theater for weakness, that the past week of Johnson's apparent fear had been performance, that he'd been outmaneuvered by someone operating on a level he couldn't comprehend. Johnson walked out into the late afternoon sun, knowing that Cooper would likely warn his associates that they might flee or prepare for arrest. He didn't care, because the trap was already closed. The FBI had enough evidence. The NYPD was positioned. The community was mobilized. And on June 25th, the world would see what happened when hatred encountered organized, strategic, unstoppable opposition. June 25th, 1956, 1:45 p.m. Columbus Circle sparkled in afternoon sunlight. The intersection where Broadway, 8th Avenue, and Central Park West converged, one of Manhattan's busiest public spaces. On a typical Tuesday afternoon, thousands of New Yorkers would pass through. Workers on lunch breaks, tourists visiting Central Park, shoppers heading to department stores. But today wasn't typical. By 1:45 p.m., 70 NYPD officers had positioned themselves throughout the circle. Uniformed patrol, plainclothes detectives, even mounted police on the Central Park side. Captain Harrigan coordinated operations from a command post in a nearby building, maintaining radio contact with every unit. At 1:50 p.m., William Cooper and 23 associates arrived in 5 vehicles. They carried signs with slogans too vile to reproduce here. Messages celebrating segregation, denouncing integration, calling for racial purity. Several wore improvised uniforms suggesting paramilitary organization. One man carried a Confederate flag. They gathered near the monument to Christopher Columbus at the Circle's center, began unpacking their materials, preparing for what they clearly believed would be a confrontational demonstration that would generate headlines and prove white supremacy could operate anywhere. What happened instead would become a legendary moment in New York civil rights history, though the full story wouldn't be told until decades later. At 2 p.m. exactly, 200 black New Yorkers entered Columbus Circle from 4 different directions. But they didn't march, didn't protest, didn't chant or carry signs or acknowledge Cooper's group in any way. They simply existed. Families walked through, heading to Central Park for afternoon picnics. College students crossed the circle on their way to Columbia University libraries. Well-dressed professionals bought hot dogs from street vendors and sat on benches reading newspapers. Elderly couples strolled arm in arm, discussing the weather. Among them, Ruthie Johnson, wearing her yellow sundress, walking with her mother Mamie and sister Margaret. They stopped at a coffee shop on the circle's edge, ordered drinks, sat at an outdoor table, and talked about Margaret's upcoming school trip, completely ignoring the hate group 20 yards away. According to journalist Theodore Poston, who covered the event for the New York Post, the contrast was devastating. Here were 200 black citizens demonstrating through their mere presence that they belonged in New York's public spaces, shopping, socializing, living full lives, while a tiny group of outsiders screamed increasingly desperate slogans that no one acknowledged. Cooper's group tried to provoke reactions. They shouted. They waved their signs. They attempted to block pathways. The NYPD moved in immediately, not violently but firmly. Officers created barriers, ensuring Cooper's group couldn't physically intimidate anyone. When one of Cooper's associates attempted to approach a black family with children, 2 officers intervened so quickly that the man never got within 10 feet. By 2:30 p.m., media had arrived. Television cameras from NBC and CBS. Newspaper photographers from the Times, the Herald Tribune, the Daily News. Radio reporters recording live coverage. What they captured was extraordinary. A handful of angry white men looking increasingly impotent and foolish, while hundreds of New Yorkers, black and white, simply went about their business, demonstrating through indifference that hate had no power here. At 2:47 p.m., FBI agents moved in. Special Agent Lucy led a team of 12 agents through the circle, approaching Cooper directly. The arrest was quiet, professional, almost anticlimactic. William Cooper, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit interstate violence, illegal weapons trafficking, and violation of federal civil rights statutes. You have the right to remain silent. Cooper's associates scattered, some toward their vehicles, some on foot. All were intercepted by NYPD officers coordinating with the FBI. By 3:15 p.m., 17 individuals had been arrested. The remaining 6 fled the scene, but would be arrested within 48 hours. The entire confrontation, from Cooper's arrival to the final arrests, lasted 1 hour and 32 minutes. Not a single punch was thrown. Not a single weapon was displayed. Not a single civilian was injured. And sitting at a coffee shop table on Columbus Circle's edge, Ruthie Johnson watched the men who'd terrorized her being loaded into FBI vehicles. "Is it over?" she asked her father, who'd appear beside their table during the arrests. Seemingly out of nowhere, though Ruthie would learn later he'd been watching from a nearby building the entire time. "It's over," Bumpy confirmed. "You can go back to school tomorrow. Back to normal life." Was any of this normal? Margaret asked, looking at the scene with teenage bewilderment. Bumpy smiled. A genuine expression, not the calculated coldness his enemies saw. "No, baby girl. But maybe it's the start of something better than normal. Maybe it's the start of safety." The media coverage that followed exceeded even Johnson's strategic calculations. The New York Times ran a front-page story, "FBI arrests white supremacist group in Manhattan. Plot to intimidate black families uncovered." The article detailed the arrests, the investigation, and prominently featured interviews with black families who'd been targeted for intimidation, though the Johnson family wasn't identified by name. The Amsterdam news coverage was more direct. Klan attempt to terrorize Harlem ends in humiliating defeat. Their article celebrated both the FBI action and the community's organized response. But the most significant coverage came from Thurgood Marshall himself, speaking to reporters the next day. What happened at Columbus Circle demonstrates that when law enforcement, civil rights organizations, and communities work together, hate has no chance. The individuals arrested were attempting to import Southern terrorism into New York. They failed because New York, black and white together, refused to tolerate it. Marshall never mentioned Bumpy Johnson's role, never acknowledged the complicated alliance that had made the operation possible. But in Harlem, everyone knew. June 27, 1956. The federal courthouse in Lower Manhattan was packed for the arraignment of William Cooper and 16 associates. Charges included conspiracy to commit violence, illegal weapons possession, interstate transportation of firearms, and violation of federal civil rights statutes. Assistant U.S. Attorney David Marks, who'd been briefed by Agent Lucy on the investigation's origins, presented a case so overwhelming that defense attorneys immediately began negotiating plea agreements. Evidence included financial records showing $47,300 in transfers from known white supremacist organizations, intercepted correspondence discussing direct action against prominent Northern N, exact language in FBI files, too vile for reproduction here. Weapons discovered during the raid on Cooper's business. 14 firearms, several with modifications making them illegal under federal law. Testimony from 3 cooperating witnesses who'd infiltrated Cooper's organization and documented planning meetings. The case was ironclad. Cooper received 15 years in federal prison. Earl Watkins, Vernon Hayes, and 3 others received sentences ranging from 8 to 12 years. The remaining defendants accepted plea agreements for reduced sentences in exchange for testimony against white supremacist networks across the Northeast. The Southern Heritage Foundation was exposed as a Klan front organization, lost its tax-exempt status, and collapsed within months. And the message was clear: white supremacist violence would not be tolerated in New York. But there was another story unfolding simultaneously, one that wouldn't become public for decades. The FBI opened an internal investigation into how exactly they'd received the initial intelligence about Cooper's operation. Agent Lucy's reports mentioned confidential informant, standard bureau language, but several FBI supervisors questioned whether that informant was Bumpy Johnson, and if so, what deals had been made. Lucy's testimony to Internal Affairs was simple. The informant provided accurate intelligence about a credible threat. No deals were offered. No immunity was granted. The information was verified independently before action was taken. That's all that matters. The investigation was quietly closed. Captain Harrigan faced similar questions from NYPD Internal Affairs about his coordination with community sources. His answer was equally simple. I received intelligence about a planned violent demonstration. I deployed officers to prevent it. That's my job. The source of the intelligence is less important than its accuracy. That investigation was also closed. Thurgood Marshall was never questioned about his role, because officially he had no role beyond making a public statement about hate group activity. The meeting in Brooklyn never appeared in any record. And Bumpy Johnson? He was never interviewed, never questioned, never connected to the operation in any official capacity. According to FBI surveillance logs, on June 26th, the day after the arrests, Johnson returned to his regular routine. Breakfast at Wells' Supper Club, meetings at his social clubs, visible presence throughout Harlem. Business as usual, except for one detail noted by FBI observers. Subject appeared more relaxed than typical. Spent extended time with family members at residence. No security precautions observed beyond normal measures. For the first time in 9 days, Ruthie and Margaret Johnson walked freely through Harlem without fear. July 15, 1956. 3 weeks after the Columbus Circle arrests, Bumpy Johnson sat in his study at 409 Edgecombe Avenue, meeting with his inner circle. Cat Williams, Teddy Simmons, Red Mitchell, Sol Greenberg, and Madame St. Clair. We need to discuss what happened, St. Clair said. And more importantly, what didn't happen. What didn't happen, Johnson replied, is that my family didn't get hurt. That's all I care about. But you created alliances with the FBI, the NYPD, civil rights organizations, Teddy Simmons noted. Alliances that could be used again, or could be used against you. Johnson nodded slowly. Yes, and that's the risk. I showed them I'm willing to cooperate when interests align. That makes me more valuable alive than arrested, but also gives them leverage. Was it worth it? Cat Williams asked. Johnson looked toward the window, where evening light was painting Harlem in gold. Somewhere out there, his daughters were walking home from a summer movie, carrying ice cream cones, laughing about something only teenagers find hilarious. Ask me that question again if anything ever happens to them, Johnson said quietly. Until then, yes. It was worth it. The conversation moved to other business, operational details, financial matters, the routine concerns of running a criminal empire. But everyone in the room understood that something fundamental had changed. Bumpy Johnson had proven he could work with his enemies when necessary. He demonstrated that protecting black families mattered more than maintaining his outlaw reputation. And he'd shown that sometimes the most powerful response to violence wasn't more violence. It was the systematic, strategic dismantling of your enemy's entire operation. The lesson wasn't lost on anyone who understood Harlem's power dynamics. Over the next decade, similar incidents would occur. Attempts by white supremacist groups to intimidate black leaders, to attack civil rights workers, to import Southern terrorism into northern cities. And repeatedly, those attempts would fail. Not always because of Bumpy Johnson directly, though his methods influenced many responses, but because the Columbus Circle incident had established a template: community organization, law enforcement cooperation, public humiliation of hate groups, and federal prosecution. The template worked. By 1960, the Klan's attempted expansion into northern cities had largely failed. Not because hatred disappeared, it didn't, but because organized, strategic opposition had proven more powerful than racist intimidation. November 2003. Mamie Johnson, widow of Bumpy Johnson, sat in her Harlem apartment being interviewed by researchers from Columbia University's Oral History Project. She was 93 years old, sharp-minded, and finally willing to discuss events she'd kept secret for decades. The researchers asked about the 1956 incident involving her daughter Ruthie. People always wanted Bumpy to be either a hero or a villain, Mamie said. They couldn't accept that he was both, or neither. He was just a father who loved his children and would do anything, work with his enemies, risk his own freedom, sacrifice his reputation to protect them. Did Ruthie ever talk about what happened? A researcher asked. Mamie smiled. She became a civil rights attorney, worked for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, spent 40 years fighting the kind of hatred that followed her home that day. She died in 1998, but before she passed, she told me something I'll never forget. What did she say? She said, "Daddy taught me that real power isn't about being feared. It's about having so many resources, so many relationships, so many strategic advantages that your enemies defeat themselves." That's what I've tried to do through law. Create systems where injustice becomes untenable. The researchers were silent, absorbing the implications. Finally, one asked, "Mrs. Johnson, do you think your husband's methods were justified?" Mamie looked out her window toward the Harlem streets her husband had controlled for 30 years. Justified? I don't know. Necessary? Absolutely. Ineffective? My daughters lived full, safe, accomplished lives. That's the only justification I need. Today, the story of what happened in June 1956 exists in fragments. FBI files with redacted sections, oral histories from witnesses now deceased, newspaper articles that never quite captured the full truth. There's no official record of Bumpy Johnson's role. No acknowledgement of the alliance between a criminal and law enforcement. No documentation of how one father's fury became an entire city's protection. Just silence. And in that silence, a lesson that still echoes. When you threaten someone's children, you don't just make an enemy. You create someone with nothing left to lose and every resource to deploy. William Cooper and his associates learned that lesson in federal prison. Every white supremacist group that considered northern expansion learned it through their failure. And every black family in Harlem learned that even in a city that didn't always protect them, sometimes, just sometimes, someone was watching over them. Even if that someone operated in shadows the law couldn't acknowledge.